We are here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bring news just for you. It's Tuesday, December 17th here in Seoul. I'm Song Yujin and you're watching News Generation. Today we're joined by Im Sang-hyuk.
Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday, and Grace Park.
Hello.
Hi. Now both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. So it's Tuesday, which means we're going to start off with our keyword news. Today's keyword is airplane. Now with Christmas and New Year's holidays around the corner, we're entering a busy travel season. And here's a question for you if you're planning to travel. Do you think it's rude to recline your seat on an airplane? Now, this has long been one of the most hotly debated topics when it comes to air travel, and the question recently resurfaced online after a journalist based in Korea shared her experience while flying to Europe on a business trip. Although airlines generally allow passengers to recline their seats except during takeoff, landing, and meal service, the woman sitting behind her asked her not to lean her seat back. But when the journalist did recline, she woke up in the middle of the night to the woman kicking her seat and complaining about how cramped it was. So it seems that just because you can recline doesn't mean everyone thinks you should. So what are your thoughts on this very divisive topic?
Yeah, I would say that reclining your seats on a flight is okay, and that the seats are precisely meant to be used for that function. Now, I believe that passengers should comply when asked to return their seats back upright during meals or during takeoff and landing. But, I do know that it can get annoying sometimes when you can't, you don't have enough personal space because of the fully reclined seat in front of you. But I think it's more so the responsibility of the airlines to perhaps limit the degree of recline or even widen the seats between the spaces between the seats. And I see it almost as a right of the passengers to freely adjust their seats as they please because that's what they paid for as consumers.
Because they paid for this airplane ticket, which includes their right to recline their seats. And the person behind that seat also knew that probably and then paid for the ticket as well. So Sang-hyuk, what do you think then?
Well, I think the best way to get around this is to call the flight attendant and file the complaint officially.
That sounds very scary.
Well, because I believe that every airline has their own manual on how to respond to such disputes among passengers. But the bottom line here that I want to emphasize is that it really surprised me how the airlines' seats are getting cramped every year, although the airplanes are getting bigger each year, not to mention the expensive ticket fares as well. So as someone who frequently uses the airplanes due to my business trip, I just wish that, like Eunye said, the airlines would consider widening the distance between the seats, and I hope the aviation laws are legislated to actually guarantee enough amount of space between the seats.
Right, so maybe the best way to kind of prevent these tensions and conflicts is kind of asking the flight attendant or the airline to take care of these issues when they arise. And that was our keyword news for this Tuesday. So we're now going to move on to our main discussion of the day. Today we're going to talk about what's the latest on Korea's cultural front. Take a look at the screen to find out more.
Sing K-pop songs, waving colorful light sticks, and chanting in unison. What you're watching might look like a K-pop concert, but it's not. This is the scene at one of the protests calling for South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol to step down, following his failed attempt at martial law 2 weeks ago. It's very different from the traditional image of protests and rallies. And it's our generation leading the charge in redefining what protests look like.
So we've talked about this topic yesterday on NewsGen as well. Now, since the short-lived martial law order on the night of December 3rd here in South Korea, protests calling for the resignation or impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol, who imposed the order, have been taking place here in the country almost every day until the impeachment motion was passed last Saturday, which was December 14th. And what's especially noteworthy is the significant involvement of young people and how these protests have kind of turned around and taken on a more festive rather than a solemn mood, almost like K-pop concerts. So, Sang-hyuk, could you give us more details?
Yeah, so as we just saw in the screen, it felt more like a concert rather than a protest. And there were even some protesters who were singing along the K-pop songs and also dancing during the protest. And there is even YouTube video making the playlist of these protest songs as well. And also we have the special traditional Korean protest song that was popular back in the 80s when Korea was suffering from years of dictatorship. And those songs are getting popularity once again. And another thing that caught my attention was different types of K-pop idol light sticks. And this is actually due to the remark made by one politician back in 2016 when there were rallies against the corruption of then President Park Geun-hye. So at the time, the politician said, "The wind will blow away the candles and raging the public." So since then, many protesters actually brought LED candles and light sticks to the protest.
Right.
And also the sticks represent the identity of each protester, as South Korea is well known for diverse K-pop fandoms. They are also a symbol of solidarity and unity. So in this protest, many different fans of different idol groups came together with one voice. And some even say that the martial law has in fact made all fandoms to be united, which was considered to be impossible. And because light sticks became so popular, some people even buy them in the second-hand online shopping malls or even borrow them from other people.
Right, so light sticks have definitely garnered huge attention during these protests calling for the resignation or impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. And we've just seen footage of these K-pop colored or K-pop flavored protests. That's kind of where people chanted or sang K-pop songs together and also waved colorful light sticks. But it's not just this scene that has drawn the attention of many around the world. Another aspect that stood out is actually the peaceful nature of how these protests were proceeded, right, Grace?
That's right. We saw hundreds of thousands of people gathered in various parts of Seoul for peaceful nightly candlelight protests with no major physical confrontations. This rather calm atmosphere was based on a shared objective as well as the lessons learned from the nonviolent protests that have now become the norm for such events in recent years. The protests have also bridged generational divides and showcased a rare blending of people across differences in gender and political orientation. Even in tense moments, participants have made visible efforts to avoid physical clashes. For instance, the police advised protesters to move off the streets and onto the sidewalks, and both organizers and participants willingly complied. Also, organizers like the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy distributed guidelines emphasizing inclusivity and respect, with instructions to avoid discriminatory or objectifying language toward women, sexual minorities, disabled people, and teenagers.
And this is definitely a difference from the protests and rallies that we've seen in the past, because I think a lot of people will imagine protesters clashing with the police when they think of the traditional rallies that used to take place here in the country. And as Sang-hyuk mentioned, we've seen protests and rallies demanding a president step down before here in South Korea, such as the candlelight protest in 2016 over then President Park Geun-hye's corruption scandal. And after 8 years, the style of these demonstrations has changed a lot, as you can see from the screen. So Sang-hyuk, could you share us a bit more about what kind of sets the protests this time apart from the previous ones?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between the protests of today and those in the past is the gender and age. The martial law protest was mainly led by women in their 20s. So younger generations are also used to the fan culture, making actions together in a peaceful way. MZers did came to the rallies during the protest against former President Park Geun-hye in 2016. But today's protest is more lively.
Right.
And during the protest against dictators in the 80s, there were aggressive actions like threatening the public with rifles or throwing gasoline bombs. But I'm just glad the present day's protest is peaceful, yet echoing the public message very clearly.
So this is definitely a new protest culture that we're seeing being introduced and led by the young generation here in Korea. Now, Grace, are there any other new aspects of the protests that you found that you'd like to introduce to our viewers?
Sure. While protesters in South Korea have long employed songs, dances, and chants, this time the difference was that it felt much more festive and even hip.
Right, the mood was different.
Right. And in fact, along Along with the light sticks that Sang-hyuk mentioned, we also saw flags carrying messages and memes from mainly younger demonstrators. And the sheer diversity of these flags has been striking. In most Korean protests, banners tend to reflect organizations involved like labor unions or political groups. But this time, we could see that young Koreans are utilizing humor and satire to vent their frustrations. I'm not sure if these unions really exist, but some of the flags at the protests could be translated into English as the National Procrastination Union, Stay at Home Coalition, Overweight Cat Union, and Homebody Gamers United.
Very interesting names that these flags are indeed showing. Now, so our generation is creating these memes and these satires, and also, as Sang-hyuk mentioned, a large proportion of the protesters who took to the streets this time were actually made up of those in their 20s, and also more specifically women. So why do you think it is our generation that is shaping and leading this new culture of protesting?
Well, the millennials and Gen Z are those who pursue like effective measures, and at the same time they also try to be smart and also peaceful at the same time. So these MZers enjoy the rally like festival, as we have just seen in the VCR video, and at the same time they try to obey with the law and regulation. So usually blood and violence were prominent during protests if we think about the pre-modern Korean history, but those behaviors are now considered outdated. So because of this peaceful mood, the general public who used to stay low-key during the protest season, like myself, have also become interested in this new protest culture.
Right, because this new festive and very open mood makes these protests more welcoming, making it more easier and accessible for young people who are new to protest to actually think about taking part in it. And what do you think, Grace?
I definitely see the rise of social media having a huge influence on the way that protests are happening here. I'm sure that we've all seen videos go viral on social media of the massive crowds chanting and moving their light sticks in unison. It feels like the rallies this time are more accessible and even more enjoyable than those from the past, as young participants share their experiences creatively on social media, encouraging others to join. We've also seen the images of witty banners, like I mentioned earlier, from fandoms to food lovers, from pet owners and gamers to procrastinators even. A variety of people who've joined the demonstrations in their own unique ways, employing humor as a weapon of resistance.
Which is making these protests more attractive to young protesters once again. Now, expanding our discussion from the studio, we also asked your viewers around the world whether they saw the recent protests in South Korea and what they thought about them. And here's what 3 of them said. Our first comment for today, live free or perish. I admire Koreans for working through this crisis peacefully. Rico Torres 7845 says, very unique and quintessentially Korean. It demonstrates Korea's tacit brotherhood and shows the high esteem of the community. Soniku 113 says, I like the mixture of K-pop with the protests and the unique flags protesters have made. It makes protesting not just a civic duty, but something cool and fun, attracting more of a youthful crowd and energy to the protests. So we've taken a look at our viewers' comments. Now, broadening our discussion even more for more on how Korea's new protest culture is being perceived in other parts of the world, we're going to invite a freelance broadcaster based in Seoul to our talks after a short break.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search our channel Arirang.News. Click Community and leave a comment down below. Make a new type of news with us.
Today, we're joined by Colin Marshall, a Seoul-based essayist and freelance broadcaster. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us and good morning. So Colin, our first question for you is, how have international media outlets reacted to or reported on this unique style of protest in South Korea that we've been seeing recently?
Well, I would say the international media have been reporting with great fascination on these protests because South Korea, especially to the media in the United States, where I'm from, has long been associated with this culture of protest. Even in the 1980s, when a story broke about South Korea, it probably had to do with this culture of protest. But now, in the 21st century, in the 2020s, you have this additional aspect of Korea not just being known, not even primarily being known, as a country of protests, as a country of political conflict, but as a hot pop culture. You know, we have K-pop, we have K-drama, film, the whole Hallyu Korean wave, and these two elements of Korea have converged in the reportage about the protest against Yoon Suk-yeol. On the New York Times, actually, the New York Times published a whole story just about the music, just about, in fact, the singer Bekta's reinterpretation of the song Feliz Navidad, the Christmas song by Jose Feliciano, to become Taneki Tapida, a song about how impeachment is the answer. That got a whole article in the New York Times. But more so than the music, more so than the sort of joyfulness, which has also been a big aspect of foreign coverage, especially the U.S. media, has been framing this as a sort of lesson for the United States. You know, if democracy were to be imperiled in the U.S., would South Korea's response be the right lesson for the American people? Would it even apply? And it's an interesting framing. I do think it's a little too U.S.-centric. I think American and Korean politics don't actually have that much in common, especially on a deeper level, on a superficial level maybe. But I think this can be, I would like to see a little more coverage that takes it on its own terms, that views South Korean politics and the nature of political conflict here in a way that makes sense in South Korea rather than framing it in American terms.
Okay, Colin, thank you for your concise opinions. So from your perspective, how do these recent protests in Korea compare to those in other countries? Do you see anything particularly unique or noteworthy about them?
Unfortunately, I haven't actually attended protests in other countries, but I've seen coverage of them like we all have. And when I was out at the National Assembly building here in Seoul last week to see what was going on, the first thing I saw was, of course, the vendors, these sort of small-time capitalists, you might say, selling their glow sticks, their light-up candles, capitalizing on this trend, or I don't know if you could call it a trend exactly, but capitalizing on one of the most notable phenomena of these protests, visually speaking, which is the use of these not just light-up candles like we had with the Park Geun-hye protests, but K-pop style glow sticks, which, as I understand it, I've never been to a K-pop concert, but they are quite a common convention in that setting for people to hold up their sticks to express their solidarity with the group on stage or with the cause being protested about, as the case may be. And The Guardian published recently a piece on the two faces of Korea. That's what they call them. They use this framing. Korea has one face where it's the Hallyu, the K-pop, all this exciting stuff that gets people from all around the world, especially young people, to pay attention. But the other face being this sort of grim, stern, militaristic culture that dates back from the 60s, 70s, and dates back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These are the two faces, according to The Guardian's scheme they used for the story. And they converge with this protest that also uses the techniques, shall we say, of K-pop fandom, of mobilizing people who are concerned, especially young people who are concerned about what's at issue here. And I think, yes, youth is important to emphasize, the youth of the protesters on a show like this. When I went to the protest last week, I noticed not just the vendors of glow sticks, but also the fact that the protesters were about 10 years younger on average than the ones I saw in 2016 against Park Geun-hye.
Thank you for your insights, Colin. If these protests against President Yoon continue, do you think we might see further changes in their style and approach?
I think of necessity, yes, because as we all know, if you want to stay on the news, you've got to keep changing what you're doing. You've got to keep changing your style. You can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. So in order to retain attention, especially in the wider world, not just in Korea, I suppose that would be necessary, a change of style. But one consideration here is that the protesters have won the battle, if not the war. So impeachment proceedings will begin. The Constitutional Court has to decide whether to remove President Yoon from power permanently. And so whether the protest can continue through those months is another question. Of course, people are busy in Korea. They've got things to do. I don't know if they can stay out there for 3 months. But if the Constitutional Court were to decide not to remove Yoon Suk-yeol from power, then I would imagine we would see a new wave of protests, which would be not just different in style, but I think different in character, because the people versus the executive versus the president is something we've seen here in Korea before. But the people versus the Constitutional Court is something else entirely. It would take a protest, it would take this concept of protest to a different level. And it would raise different questions about sort of the nature of democracy in Korea as well. But there is one change I would hope for with these protests, which is now that we're past this phase of the impeachment proceedings beginning, I would hope that protesters can focus not just on the negative, not just on what they don't want, which historically is the strength of protest culture in Korea or elsewhere, but on what they do. Who has a positive vision for the Republic of Korea? Don't just think about what you don't want, who you want out of power. Who do you want in power? And who could maybe avoid this vengeance-oriented dynamic of Korean politics in the future? These are questions I think protesters would do well to think about, rather than just, get rid of whoever we don't like. That won't fix everything by itself.
Definitely. All right, Colin, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So protests have long symbolized hope and served as a catalyst for change in South Korea's fight for democracy. And this is what we've seen recently, young people transcending political ideologies coming out to the streets for one common voice. And what the previous generation has been carrying on, and it is still being carried forward by our generation in a new style. And members of our generation are driving change while upholding the core purpose of these protests, which is to protect and preserve our country's democratic values. So ending off, would you like to share any final thoughts after today's discussion?
Yeah, so as we have talked throughout today's episode, I can see that today's protest is led by younger generation, which means that youths are no longer an outsider when it comes to political issues. So just like the rallies in the 80s, I'm glad that young people are paying, once again, more attention to the politics.
And hope they pay more attention so that we can bring needed change in our society as well. What do you think, Grace?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to see the resilience of the Korean people living on and evolving throughout time with the changing generations. The younger generation in Korea is definitely integrating the current cultural elements like K-pop, individualism, and innovation to creatively voice their opinions on critical issues. So I think that's great.
Right, but they're still carrying on the values that their previous generation safeguarded.
Exactly. Right.
All right, and that's all the time we have for today, but NewsGen will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time. Special thanks today to Im Sang-hyuk.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and Grace Park.
Thank you. I had a
Thank
great
you.
time.
Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. We are
News
Generation.